We'll go ahead and get started. So I want to go just right off the bat and welcome everybody to the second week of the Civic Spark Poster Symposium series. We are here today to celebrate the accomplishments of the 2021 Civic Spark Fellow cohort. For those of you that don't know who I am, my name is Savannah Rose. I am the North Coast Regional Coordinator here at Civic Spark, a national service program of the Local Government Commission. Today we'll be facilitating today's session, the Addressing California's Affordable Housing Crisis. Just a couple of logistical details before we get started. If you do experience any technical difficulties during today's call, please message Richard Bali directly using the chat feature, and he'll be able to help troubleshoot, as I may not be able to see some incoming messages. Every fellow will have around 5 to 6 minutes to present their capstone posters, and some of the supplementary slides that they've all put together. Their posters really do just summarize the key accomplishments from their past 11 months of their AmeriCorps service term from all the local governments that they've been serving across California. After each presentation, we will be opening up for a couple of questions from the audience, which you may be able to ask directly by unmuting yourself or sending them through the chat box. Finally, just wanting to encourage audience participation throughout this virtual event. So please go ahead and share your encouragement and your congratulations through the chat box as each fellow presents. We encourage you all to turn on your webcams if that's available to you. But with that, I will kick it off for the main show. I'll be starting off the day hearing from Lorenzo Simon, serving with the City of Antioch, followed by Elizabeth Havey, serving with the City of Arden. So Lorenzo, I will give it over to you.
All right. Hello, everybody. My name is Lorenzo Simon. I am Civic Spark Fellow with the City of Antioch. I work with both the environmental resources and housing divisions at the city. And I'm going to really get this started off with a bang because my presentation won't be at least directly related to to the affordable housing crisis in the state. For a variety of reasons, my housing projects kind of very specific to the city and are not as applicable to other jurisdictions or other organizations. They're also, quite frankly, not as interesting to discuss. So instead, I'm going to be talking about community engagement at the City of Antioch and how we've been trying to build some engagement capacity to make that engagement more equitable and more effective in general. So to provide a bit of background on why we are doing this project, in May of 2020, the Antioch City Council adopted the Climate Action and Resilience Plan. I'm a second-year fellow, and that was kind of my main project over the course of my first year, last year. However, as many of you are probably familiar with, COVID-19 really disrupted some of what we were doing in terms of the next steps of implementation and engagement for the CARB. So that was kind of the environmental side, environmental motivation for doing this. And then on the housing side, more directly, a lot of the motivation simply came from wanting to do an effective job in getting out a lot of this COVID relief money that we had. So a lot of the previous engagement that the City of Antioch had done was really focused on in-person interaction and social media interaction. Obviously, a lot of the in-person stuff was no longer viable during COVID. So my job was to put together some tools that we could use to make that engagement more flexible going forward so that we could continue doing a good job of engagement no matter what was actually thrown at us. So two main tools came out of this project. So the first was the Community Engagement Guide, and second was the Community Organizations Directory. So the Community Organizations Directory is a little more straightforward. It's essentially lists hundreds of organizations that serve Antioch communities, be they nonprofit, government organizations, faith-based organizations, any sort of community service organizations. It even gets out, to certain grocery stores and radio stations. And you can kind of sort this database through the actual services that are provided or by the populations that are served by the organizations to give some ease of use in terms of flexibility for whoever wants to use this database for engagement. And we need to do some tweaks, but we're eventually hoping to make this publicly available. In terms of the community engagement guide, that is really focused on a few things. So first, it lays out a variety of strategies that the city can use to connect with Antioch communities. And then it goes into some depth on how the city of Antioch can use these strategies and can implement these strategies in equitable ways to reach like the diverse array of communities that live and work in Antioch. It also takes an approach at some more like structural issues in terms of capacity that exists in the city of Antioch. One example is, as you can see on the poster, bringing in a community advocate that can work closely with the environmental services and housing divisions to connect much more deeply with Antioch communities and generate that two-way communication a lot more effectively than, if it's me, a Civic Spark fellow from, could be somewhere out of the state, definitely somewhere out of the city, coming in and trying to put these things together. 11 months, that person's gone and everything falls apart. So there are a few opportunities for use for all these tools at the city. Obviously, we talked about CARP implementation, climate action and resilience plan implementation. On the housing side, there's some opportunities as well, not just trying to get out this information, let people know that there are these services that we provide that they can take advantage of, but also encouraging and empowering the community members to send us feedback to help us understand, how we can actually improve these programs and, help us understand where there are gaps in service that need to be filled. And right now, what we are working on over the course of the summer is that we are doing some experimenting with some of these strategies that we laid out in the guide, working with Pilot City, which is an internship program that pairs high school students with employers. We, the city of Antioch, are an employer this summer. And right now, students are working on a couple of things. They're working on developing video forms to address some of the language barriers that exist in the implementation of engagement strategies, and also working on developing different text messaging strategies so that we can try to reach people who may not have internet access. And one of the cool things with this program is that because the students are actually from Antioch, they don't solely need to rely on our networks to proceed with their projects. They can actually tap into their own communities and their own resources to kind of get a better idea of what is really needed on the engagement side. So that is where we are right now. I'm hopeful that this process will jumpstart some deeper engagement in the city. And I am hopeful because, for example, the community organizations directory has already been requested by a bunch of different departments for them to actually do their own engagement. So that is what I have for you today. If anyone has any questions, feel free to ask. And I know I was a bit vague with a lot of this stuff. So if you want some more detail, then you can just send me an email and I'd be happy to respond.
All right. Congratulations, Lorenzo, and thank you for your service. So I'd like to open it up for a couple of speakers from the audience at this time. So it looks like we got one in the chat box from Shauna. So just saying that, great job. But could you share a little bit about your work as a first year fellow and how it impacted your project work in your second year?
Yeah, I can. So like I said, my first year, I spent a lot of time working on the Climate Action and Resilience Plan. It was adopted in May, but we had a lot of trouble trying to get other departments on board for a lot of the projects that we wanted to move forward with. And the projects that we could actually move forward with by ourselves fell through due to COVID. One example was that we were working with Rising Suns program in which they go into people's homes and do energy audits. And we were hoping to combine that with the Contra Costa County weatherization program so that the students could get their experience doing the audits. And then if people qualified, we could refer them to the weatherization program, help them out with the paperwork and all that sort of thing. So that fell through because people couldn't go into homes anymore. And it was difficult for me to understand, what were the next steps going to be if I wasn't going to be there. So one thing I was worried about is that after writing this entire plan, it would essentially sit on the shelf and gather dust for a while, indefinitely. I don't know. So that was a lot of the motivation that I had to come back the second year and actually, try to move past some of the barriers that we had in terms of those next steps of implementation.
Alrighty. Thanks again, Lorenzo. And next up, we'll hear from Elizabeth, followed by Carrie Simmons, serving with the Metropolitan Transportation Commission in the Association of Bay Area Governments. So, Lizzie, I will hand it over to you.
Okay, great. Thank you. My name is Elizabeth Habe. I go by Lizzie. I have a degree in social work with a unique emphasis in community engagement and environmental social work. And that's what led me to my position with Civic Spark. My project is catalyzing community resiliency through housing, economics, and energy efficiency with the city of Arvin. And that's really the big for cities across the state of California is like, how can we be resilient in all those different sectors, right? The city of Arvin is a rural city located near Bakersfield, just southeast of Bakersfield in Kern County. The population is around 20,000 people, so it's a small city in the Central Valley. I work directly with the Community Development Department, and I've had the chance to work with many of the staff members too from various departments because of the city size itself, which is really a benefit in that way. So today I'll just be talking about some of the projects I worked on throughout the year. Going to share some specific examples around planning for housing, outreach, and program implementation. And really my first half of the year focused on housing. My first big task was to develop a housing element equity assessment. Through conversations and interviews with my project site and to better meet the needs of the department, I provided a review of the housing element with this lens of equity to prioritize actionable items for the city. To guide an equity focused document, a lot of resources, as many resources as I can, right? To name a few, I looked at the housing toolkit from Institute for Local Government. I reviewed racial equity impact assessments. I looked at that from consulting groups like Greenlining Institute and a number of cities, such as the city of Austin as well. And although the implementation of that is different, it still definitely informed my work. I also looked at environmental justice general plan guidelines, those resources from the Governor's Office of Planning and Research, as SB 1000 was a big driver for this equity assessment. And SB 1000 is the environmental justice implementation element implementation for California general plans. So again, that was a driving factor to really prepare the city for the next housing element update that's right around the corner. And what can the city do now to meet the different programs in the housing element? And how can we better prioritize that in the lens of equity, right? So of course, deep dive into California housing element law. I looked at to Abundant Housing LA and some of the resources that they're putting out as well. And specifically now with HCD, Department of Housing Community Development, enforcing more of these housing element laws, that was the big factor for doing this work. To get more into the process, I first reviewed the housing element. I documented and provided commentary and analysis in all the different sections to include the demographics of the community that the city serves and the unique housing and environmental issues a small Central Valley city faces. That in turn turned into actionable items for the city and recommendations based off, the review of the housing element front to back, right? What is relevant and doable for the city of Arvin as a disadvantaged community with limited resources as well. To kind of put in perspective, the average household in Arvin is 40% larger than the Kern County average, and residents do face overcrowding. There's additional unique
Lizzie, we may have lost you. Alrighty, folks. Well, while we wait to get Lizzie back in, we'll go ahead and move forward with our next fellow, Carrie Simmons, who is serving with the Metropolitan Transportation Commission. So while we wait, we can circle back to Lizzie. We'll kick it off with Carrie right now.
Great. All right. Good afternoon, everyone. I want to start off by saying thanks to my co-fellows for presenting their great work, and also a shout out to my colleagues, Michael and Rachel, who played major roles in what I'll be presenting on today. So my name is Carrie Simmons, and I am a Resilience Fellow serving with the Metropolitan Transportation Commission and Association of Bay Area Governments. My work with the agency was really centered around making Bay Area housing resilient. And what this means is having housing in our region that is able to withstand, adapt, and rapidly bounce back from a destabilizing event, such as a wildfire, a flood, or an earthquake. And our goal was to really ensure that both existing housing and to be constructed homes are built to last in the future, with climate threats becoming more frequent and even more intense. And we identified the current housing element update as this golden opportunity that Bay Area cities can use to integrate resilience because, one, it's required by law, and two, it's when cities must make these challenging decisions on where they're going to site future housing, what housing policies they would like to include in their elements, and also where they begin to weigh the trade-offs between building housing, enhancing equity, and furthering their adaptation goals. And so today I'm going to be presenting on a tool that I helped to create called the Resilient Housing Policy Briefer. And in short, the goal of this product is to really provide city staff with a complete universe of resilient policies that are specifically geared toward housing that can be used as a starting point for when cities start selecting what policies they want to include in their housing elements. And so the policies are cataloged into 4 components of risk, which are shown in the equation to the right. And this equation depicts how the policies can reduce risk by either reducing the exposure, the sensitivity, the consequence of a hazard on housing, and also increase a jurisdiction's adaptive capacity to respond and recover from these hazardous events. And so directing your attention to the bottom left of the screen, I want to first zoom out for a moment and share with you that this Resilient Housing Policy Briefer is actually part of a suite of tools that our resilience team developed. And these tools really walk a jurisdiction through a 4-step process and how to integrate resilience into a housing element. And so the first step is for a city to consider the linkages between housing, safety, and environmental justice, and then decide if they want to pursue this form of integrated planning. And the second and third steps then use data tools that can help a city understand first where existing housing is currently exposed to these hazardous risks, and then where it's best to site future housing given these known areas of risks. And then finally, you start using the Resilient Housing Policy Briefer. And this offers responsive policy solutions to help respond to the risks that were identified in the previous steps. And so the next two slides I'm going to go over are going to walk you through the methodology and how we developed this tool. And then I'm going to give you a quick overview of the types of policies that we've included in our briefer. And so next slide. So we used existing resources to draw out the policies that we included in our final document. We reviewed existing state, regional, and local policy resources to get a better understanding of what's out there policy-wise. And then from this step, we ended up creating an annotated bibliography that highlights the key sections in these resources that we felt would be the most useful for a city to refer back to for further policy context. Next, we categorized and organized all of these policies by the components of risk that I mentioned earlier. We merged similar policies together. We refined policies by what we felt would be most appropriate for a housing element. And from this step, we ended up creating a large Excel file that contained over 250 policies so that a user could reference back to the original policy language and also find additional policy options. And finally, we developed our Resilient Housing Policy Briefer. And I wanted to mention a key step in this process was stakeholder engagement. We engaged with local, regional, and state adaptation and housing experts, and the stakeholders provided input on topics such as sea level rise and wildfire expertise, improving equity, what the state law requirements were, and also a realistic expectation of the capacity of local governments. Next slide. And we characterize these 62 policies in the briefer by the components of risks which I've been discussing. And so to get into what these policies are briefly, starting on the left hand of the screen, the exposure policies really use land use tools to avoid siting new housing in the most hazardous areas, and also protective measures to reduce the extent of a hazard. And we know that many communities in the Bay Area have multiple climate threats that they're facing. So really these sort of policies get at the trade-offs in siting housing in the least hazardous areas. Next, the sensitivity policies generally include measures that's going to adapt both existing and to be constructed homes by updating things like building codes and building requirements to really get at hardening and retrofitting homes to disaster events such as wildfires, flooding, extreme heat, or an earthquake. Next, the consequence policies really address the life and safety of residents who are living in their homes who are going to have to face the impacts of climate change, and also address the rebuild and recovery process of property or housing. And finally, the adaptive capacity policies really get at making government processes consistent and synchronized, ensuring that complete and updated data will be used for decision-making, and then to foster education and outreach that really elevates the local conversation. And policies in the briefer are generally not specific to climate hazards and cities will have the opportunity to really customize and tailor these policies based on their unique vulnerabilities and the needs of their communities. And what this really means is that it allows our briefer to be applicable, replicable to jurisdictions across the state of California, since all California communities are going to be responsible for siting housing in their housing elements. And they're going to be faced with making these challenging decisions and trade-offs between having to build housing, providing safety to their residents from hazards, and advancing their equity goals. Next slide. And with that, that was our Resilient Housing Policy Briefer discussion, and I would love to take any questions. Thank you for listening, and I appreciate you for tuning in.
Thanks, Carrie, and thank you for your service. So at this time, I'd like to open up for any questions from the audience. Feel free to unmute yourself or type in the chat box if you have any questions for Carrie. So Carrie, I'll ask a question. Could you walk through some of the adaptive policies that you presented on that are currently in the brief?
Sorry, could you say that again?
Yeah, just curious if you could, touch on some of the adaptive policies for kind of community engagement or kind of some of those overview of a little bit more detail of what you just presented on.
Sure. So really I guess to touch on the adaptive capacity policy piece, we have kind of 3 topics in there, and the first would be complete and updated data. And so we really want to get all jurisdictions kind of looking at the same data sets, and we offer some advice on different mapping tools and data collection tools that jurisdictions can use, so everybody is sort of on the same playing field when thinking of adaptation. We also have in there synchronized government processes. So that's really getting at the integrated approach to looking at resilience and safety and equity. And then, of course, our community education and engagement sort of policies. And that's really making sure that everyone is included in the engagement process, from making multilingual resources to really educating community members on the different types of hazards that are in their community, and really getting them involved in some of the government processes that drive housing planning.
Great. Awesome. Thanks so much, Carrie. Now that we have Lizzie back on the line, we will circle back to where Lizzie left off in her presentation. But thank you again, Carrie, and congratulations on your service. Lizzie, I will give it back to you and we'll move back on your slide.
Thank you. And sorry about that, everyone. I am going to just keep my video off for right now as I finish the presentation. Leading off with recommendations, you can see on the left, those were some of the recommendations that we had, really ranging from prioritization of low-income housing development, creation of an ADU ordinance, sphere of influence and zoning changes, so very specific to the city of Arvin, and some of those, niche changes that we need. And as a result, from our work on the housing equity review, there was other deliverables that I was able to produce. So the action items was the big one for the community development department, seeing exactly what they can do now until the next housing element process starts, which is going to be starting soon. And it was really taking those recommendations and putting those into actions. And so in terms of building new housing, I did create the affordable housing funding opportunities. So looking at all different types of opportunities, specifically from HCD, and what's going to best fit the city of Arvin and their needs as well, specifically in working with nonprofits and like affordable housing developers, and just other agencies of that nature. So you can see those as deliverables as a result of the initial review. And if we can go to the next slide, one specific program that we are also looking at was the Arvin Housing Advisory Committee. In our housing element, we talked about the advisory committee and how they will also kind of be the head of a number of other programs and implementing those programs. So this is why I sought out to be one big area to implement as soon as possible, as that committee can take on more roles for the city of Arvin and serve additional capacity, especially after I leave. So with my background in social work, I was also able to kind of go into the community engagement development, create outreach plans, and get very much into the details of how the city was going to create this housing advisory committee. And just what planning it really needs. So although this project is on hold at this time because there are other immediate needs of the city, the city of Arvin can take off from any moment with where I left off. And I also will be joining the city of Arvin for a second year. So hoping to see that can be implemented within the next year. And with that, this wraps up my presentation. Thank you guys all for hearing the rest of my presentation, and I'll take any questions at this time.
And congratulations on everything you've done to date. Opening it up for the audience to ask any questions of Lizzie. Looks like we have a question from Jacqueline. What type of housing or infill development in terms of I think the recommendations?
Yeah, so that it more specifically was relating to the type of funding opportunities that the city could apply for based off the city of Arvin's connections to a couple of consulting groups and nonprofits that have specific expertise in a couple of the grants, HCD grants, including the Joe Cerna Farm Working Housing grant, as well as the infill development. Those are the two that we considered probably to be the best option for the city of Arvin, kind of based off the housing types already existing in Arvin as well. So to be more specific, those are the type of housing and infill developments that we were looking at, which was really just about the funding opportunities.
Great. Thank you. And one more question. You could share what contributed, through the engagement with your background in social work from Angelica.
Yeah. With my background in social work, I had worked with a number of nonprofits and even advocacy groups that worked a lot around community power and engaging community members to have their voices be heard and in organizing, for example. And so I looked at some of the Central Valley groups that are doing things that are similar around some more specific issues, specifically around environmental issues. And in the past, Arvin had faced a number of issues from groups talking about housing and environmental justice issues in terms of land use planning as well. And so it was really going to get some of those groups involved. So when it comes to engagement, it's really about targeted outreach, like who is the audience that we're hoping to hear from. And we want as many residents as possible. And so being a trusted messenger is going to be really important to have those residents in these engagements, in these conversations. And that was the hope, that we could reach out to a number of community groups, not only local to Arvin, but also the broader kind of region, and seeing just connecting in those networks.
Awesome. Thanks. Lizzie, and thank you again for all of your hard work and service. Next up, we'll be hearing from Izzy Tadis, who is serving with the County of Placer.
Thanks, Savannah. Hi, everyone. My name is Izzy Tadites, and thank you for taking the time to listen to what I did over the course of the past year serving with Civic Spark. My service site was with Placer County, and I worked in their Community Development Resource Agency in their planning division, and then I specifically focused in affordable housing. So my primary focus throughout the service year was the development, adoption, and the preliminary phases of the implementation of the housing or of Placer County's 2021-2029 housing element. Today, I wanted to break down my presentation into like 3 phases, starting with developing the housing element and the adoption process. So Placer County began developing the housing element in February of 2020. The 3 major inputs that I kind of saw into the content of the housing element included the community context, stakeholder recommendations, and state requirements. Just to give a very brief synopsis of the community context in Placer County. The western part of the county is just north of Sacramento. The eastern part of the county touches like North Lake Tahoe, Tahoe City, that area. So it's a very interesting county to be working in. The 2 needs, the needs of the housing needs in western versus eastern Placer is very different. And then the current population is just under 400,000 in incorporated and unincorporated Placer. And the county has seen tremendous growth over the past 10 years and is expected to continue to grow over the next 20 years. The housing stock is primarily single family detached housing with only 10% of its units in unincorporated Placer County being multifamily. The average age in Placer is older relative to the rest of California at 41.6 years old compared to California's 36.1 years old. And 26.4% of housing units in unincorporated Placer County were vacant primarily due to vacation homes in East Placer, and that really limits the workforce housing near Lake Tahoe. So that's just a little bit of background into Placer County, and it's really laid out and thorough in the housing element. We also sought to take in recommendations from stakeholders and really focused on community input. We had 2 public workshops, 2 stakeholder meetings, a planning commission and board of supervisors hearing to review the public review draft in the summer and fall of 2020, and then 2 adoption hearings that were also open to the public in the spring of 2021. And we took the considerations from the public and added a lot of policies and programs based off of their recommendations into the housing element. We also really had to ensure that all the requirements from the state were met. The state housing element law mandates that local governments must adequately plan to meet the existing and projected housing needs of all economic segments of the community. These were just very general inputs that we included in the housing element. The policies and programs were also included in the updated housing element, but I saw these as more of outputs in order to get the changes and the results that we need to see in Placer County to achieve our housing goals. Moving on to the next section, the housing element included, on my poster. The housing element included 58 policies and 49 programs. Many of the policies and programs were new in the 2021-2029 housing element. And I included a list of some of the policies and programs that I assisted with the beginning implementations of here on the poster. These are just the very beginning implementation phases. We still have 8 years to work on all of the policies and programs in the updated housing element, but we're getting started right away on a lot of them. So one of the programs was to encourage shared housing. I had the opportunity to present my research on home share programs to faculty at Sierra College. Unfortunately, they have a lot of unhoused students, like sleeping in cars without permanent residences. So I presented to them on how to begin the process of creating this type of program to hopefully, house students, it's just so important. I also assisted with outreach for workforce housing in the Tahoe Basin. For example, our Hopkins Village housing that's going to be sold to Tahoe Truckee Workforce. It's about 40 units sold at affordable prices to local workforce. Finally, these policies and programs are the pieces in order to achieve our housing goals at Placer. The goals are the results of implementing the policies and programs. I listed a lot of the goals here. We really need new residential construction since our population continues to grow. Affordable housing with the high cost of housing in Placer. Innovative housing types since we primarily have single family homes. Preserving the existing housing stock to decrease housing costs. General housing in Tahoe Basin just due to the high vacancy rates and extremely high housing costs, and ensuring we have affordable housing for specialized groups of people like our very large senior population, and then generally affirmatively furthering fair housing. So I really appreciate you all taking the time to listen to my presentation today. I had an amazing year serving with Placer County and Civic Spark. I learned so much about affordable housing and grew a strong passion for this work and hope to continue to work in affordable housing in my next role. So that is the end of my presentation. I will open the floor to any questions.
All right. Congratulations, Izzy, and thanks for your service. Quick question from Shauna in the chat. If you could speak to how wildfire risk was taken into the consideration for this project work.
Sure, of course. So I didn't work a lot in wildfire mitigation, but I know that's something that we really need to strongly consider. I know our sustainability plan covers a lot in wildfire mitigation, but um, especially in the Tahoe Basin, I know we have very strict policies with how with building fire resistant homes and whatnot. I know there are some programs in the housing element that touch on that, but I unfortunately I can't think of what those policies and programs are off the top of my head.
Awesome. And a quick question from myself. Izzy, I guess other jurisdictions may be looking to website redesign. Are there specific recommendations you would in terms of accessing certain resources or other services that the county does provide for other jurisdictions as kind of more in the replicability space?
Sure. Yeah, this is something that I worked a lot on for the county. I redesigned their housing website to make it a lot more accessible, easy to navigate for people. I remember when I was interviewing for my position, I couldn't even find the housing website in the county website, so I kind of went in blind into the interviews. But I'm here, so it all worked out. But so I really wanted to make sure that people could find the information that they needed to find. I think that's extremely important. Make sure that it's very clear the differences between the housing department under planning and HHS, our Health and Human Services division, since they deal a little bit more with homelessness and addiction. We deal with more of the development of housing. So making sure that access to each department's resources are very clear and who deals with what, but providing those links and providing those names in order for people to be able to easily reach out and understand how, just the general what the county looks like and who does what. So that is something I focused a lot on, developing the housing website or redeveloping it to make it a lot more clear for people. Still more work to be done, but it's an ongoing thing. But yeah, that's definitely one of the things that I worked on a lot.
Alrighty, thanks so much, Lizzie. And up next, we're going to hear from some of our fellows serving with the Southern California Association of Governments. So that will be Claire Blackwell, Angelica Gonzalez, and Aman Pateja, who will be holding questions until the end, until all three have presented. Since they have worked so closely together, so I want to give them some time to present in succession. But we will be starting off with Claire. So Claire, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Claire, and I'm in the process of completing my first fellowship year with SCAG, or Southern California Association of Governments, which is the nation's largest metropolitan planning organization, representing 6 counties across Southern California. So the SCAG housing program was launched in 2020 as a response to the affordability crisis. While the demand for housing in California has increased, construction has significantly decreased in comparison to the last few decades, which is driving up rental and home prices throughout the region. And as most of us know, the housing crisis has cumulative impacts on individuals' everyday lives and on the region's economy as a whole. So with Regional Early Action Planning, or REAP, grant funding from AB 101, SCAG is developing programs to support local governments with housing planning activities that accelerate housing production to advance the housing goals of Connect SoCal and meet the region's goals for producing 1.3 million new units of housing by 2029, as determined by RHNA, which is the state's need-based housing allocation system. So SCAG has framed REAP programming into 3 categories to coordinate these goals. One is partnerships and outreach, regional housing policy solutions, and sustainable community strategies, or SCS integration. And my fellowship was primarily focused on partnerships and outreach, which were designed to build longer-term capacity to address housing issues by encouraging a cross-jurisdiction approach to the affordability crisis. So the Subregional Partnership Program is SCAG's largest partnerships effort aimed at encouraging intergovernmental collaboration on housing planning projects that will have a broader regional impact on housing production. And more specifically, subregional projects aim to augment and complement funds awarded to local jurisdictions by HCD, including SB2 planning grants and the local early action planning or LEAP funding in local areas. So this service term, I helped build capacity in the housing program to help subrecipients apply for and expend their awarded REAP funding across various program areas, such as ADUs, housing trust funds, AFFH, and inclusionary housing efforts, as well as other housing policy solutions. And despite the unique challenges facing each area of the region, it became clear that there was significant overlap in housing planning efforts across various funding sources and a potential to kind of maximize funding allocations through providing technical assistance resources and opportunities for peer-to-peer learning for each project type. Can you go to the next slide, please? Oh, it wasn't included. That's okay. So, for example, 7 out of 15 subrecipients of the program are planning and carrying out ADU-related projects. And these projects range in scope, but a lot of them involve some combination of tasks, such as developing a regional ADU capacity report, establishing an ADU permitting program with pre-approved floor plans to streamline development, creating a communications toolkit for homeowners with financing resources, and drafting templates for jurisdictions to use in adopting or updating their ADU ordinances. And up until now, my main focus with subrecipients carrying out these ADU projects has been sharing resources such as the recently released GIS parcel tool developed by SCAG that can help local governments identify parcels suitable for ADU development, and SCAG's regional ADU capacity report, both of which might be helpful in planning their ADU projects. And since this slide's not here, maybe I'll drop links to that after I'm finished. But as the subregional partnership projects move into the phases of planning and implementation, we're hoping to create a collaborative space for subregional project managers to collaborate and learn from one another about best practices for each types of these housing planning efforts. So I will be continuing as a second-year fellow with SCAG's housing program, supporting a selection of REAP subrecipients to carry out housing planning projects and establishing this peer-to-peer learning program to build capacity for subregions and jurisdictions to successfully implement these new housing planning projects through REAP. So thank you for listening, and also a big thank you to SCAG staff for giving us this fellowship opportunity.
Great, thanks so much, Claire. From here, we will hand it over to Angelica.
Thank you, Claire and Savannah. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Angelica, and throughout the service term, I was placed with the Southern California Association of Governments, also known as SCAG, as a housing fellow. As Claire shared with us during her presentation, SCAG's goal to increase housing production to help meet RHNA numbers involved multiple approaches. The lack of housing supply in the region has led SCAG to support accessory dwelling unit, also known as ADU development. ADUs are a growing housing trend that support the state's goal to increase housing supply, and it is a housing type that requires less resources to build, which supports SCAG's long-term commitment to building sustainable housing. Throughout the service year, I've been involved in ADU efforts as a response to legislation from recent years, as well as 2020 ADU state laws, there has been opportunity to research outcomes at the local level. Due to the demand for housing and growing attention specifically around ADUs, as well as the state's support to incentivize ADU production, there has been an increase in ADU development throughout the region. My role as a fellow was to support the development of materials that study local ADU development across the SCAG region to provide efficient technical assistance to local jurisdictions. SCAG's commitment to ADU research led to a project partnership with the Department of Urban and Regional Planning from Cal Poly Pomona. During this time, our team, including my co-fellow Aman, supported the research project to analyze the ADU potential in the region and develop the ADU physical variables inventory. My contribution in this project involved research on local standards by collecting a sample of 5 jurisdictions per county across the region's 6 counties with 2019 and 2020 ordinances that were locally adopted, and analyzing the physical variables within these ordinances. The variables that were in these ordinances included zoning, lot size, setbacks, number of units allowed per single or multifamily structures, maximum unit size, unit height limitation, and parking development standards as well. Our team then pulled variables from these ordinances into the ADU physical variables inventory. The goal of the inventory was to analyze local ordinances to identify which ones were in compliance with state ADU standards and identify which local ordinances allowed more flexibility on development standards to incentivize ADU production in the local region. Our findings were then shared with Professor Garcia from the Department of Urban and Regional Planning. In terms of next steps, I will be using the knowledge from this resource to analyze the regional permitting data progress I've been tracking from the state's Department of Housing and Community Development, also known as HCD's annual progress report dashboard, also known as APR dashboard. ADU legislation has definitely contributed to the development of ADUs across the region. And well, as a response to 2020 state laws, the region is continuing to witness growth across the region in terms of production and now permitting. In addition to these jurisdictions, more cities are joining the ADU movement and are now collaborating with SCAG to effectively initiate ADU local programs and projects as well. SCAG's goal to implement ADU planning to streamline housing production across the region will continue in the following years. And I look forward to supporting upcoming housing efforts in my second term with SCAG. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Angelica. And lastly, we will hear from Aman.
Hi, everybody. Hello and welcome to the third SCAG Housing Fellow presentation. My name is Aman Pateja, and I will be presenting on SCAG's Regional Affordable Housing Initiative and the specific portion I was tasked with, transit-oriented development. Some background information, which you've already gotten a little bit before, but I'll just go over one more time. The SCAG region covers 6 counties: Imperial, Los Angeles, Riverside, Orange, San Bernardino, and Ventura County, and about 191 cities, which, don't worry, I'm not going to list out for everybody here. As the major metropolitan planning organization for the region, SCAG aims to be a leader in equity and social justice. The current lack of affordable housing in the region has led to SCAG supporting many different strategies in efforts to bring down costs and address the housing shortage and needs established by the Regional Housing Needs Assessment. The goal of transit-oriented development sounds simple enough. It's even in the name. But what exactly does TOD mean? Essentially, it's about reducing vehicle miles traveled. It's about fostering a sense of community around transit stations, and it's about creating affordable housing adjacent to transit, thereby creating sustainable homes and communities. To this end, We're working on two major partnerships, one with LA Metro and the other with Metrolink. The Metrolink project aims to transition the traditional commuter rail into a more integrated transit-oriented development rail. Deliverables of this project include economic and market analyses, technical memorandums, and a vision and implementation strategy report. On the other hand, the LA Metro project, also known as the Housing Accelerator Project, aims to revitalize transit stops by accelerating the process in which houses can be built. Deliverables for this project include surveys, opportunity assessments, housing pilots, and data on what works and what doesn't. Next slide, please. So one of the many goals for the LA Metro project are housing pilots across the LA Metro stations. One such proposal is the West Santa Ana Branch Transit Corridor. The goal of this pilot project is to examine the engineering issues and develop the best practices and guidance on how to integrate housing into the excess maintenance facilities of the metro stations. This location was chosen because of its dense population, high amounts of disadvantaged communities, and a chance for partnership with Gateway Talk. Next slide. So that's it for my presentation. Thank you, everybody. And I just want to also thank my co-fellows, Claire and Angelica, and all the staff at SCAG that helped supported us throughout this year. Thank you.
Thank you, Mom. And congratulations to our fellows, our 3 SCAG fellows that worked on housing in the housing space. So I will go ahead and open it up to questions from the audience. And yeah. Question from Erica. How was your experience being co-fellows at SCAG?
I can answer this, or at least to start us off. It was great having co-fellows. It's great to have somebody that you feel is in the same position you're at, going through the same program that you're at, and somebody you can kind of rely on when things get tough.
Yeah, to add on to what Aman just shared, it was great having co-fellows in terms of the project development as well, just because all of us did have different concentrations, and some of us focus more on implementation versus research. For example, I focus more on research versus implementation, but when we did have a lot of cross collaboration, although research and implementation are not exactly the same thing. There was definitely a lot of collaboration. So when I did have any questions regarding any questions around the various housing programs across the state, Claire and Aman were definitely very helpful with those.
Another question from Megan. How large of a role do you think ADUs can play in solving the housing crisis?
To be completely honest, I would say that ADUs are definitely helping in terms of increasing housing production. And we're seeing more of that, as I shared, after the state's legislation in terms of incentivizing ADU production. But I would definitely also share that ADUs are just a small contribution of the whole affordable housing crisis, and that it is I recommend that we can definitely go above and beyond ADUs, just because ADUs are also limited to a certain amount of units per, let's say, single family structures. And when it comes to housing, if we do need more housing, I'd recommend looking also into multi-family structures as well, which ADUs in the end can also add to. But yeah, I would just say that ADUs are a small contribution of the entire picture of the affordable housing crisis, or at least a solution to it.
I think Angelica answered that well. I think financially there's still a lot of barriers, since the amount of homeowners that have the financial ability to build one is not going to solve the housing crisis on its own, but there's a lot of good work going on to kind of streamline development to make it easier if someone can afford to build an AU. So yeah, it's definitely one part, and it's an important part that's often overlooked.
Well, thank you again to our SCAG fellows. Next up, we will hear from Erica Copeland, who's serving with the Gateway City of Council of Government.
Thanks, Savannah, and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Erica Copeland. I'm currently serving as a housing fellow with the Gateway Cities Council of Governments, or COG. My particular focus has been on supporting planning for affordable housing supply and COVID recovery. As we know, Civic Spark aims to strengthen local government capacity and resilience. The term resilience means the ability of an organization to respond to or recover readily from a crisis. In this service year, the focus on resilience became increasingly important due to the large-scale challenges that COVID-19 presented for this region. To provide a brief background, and I'm not sure if we can pull up the slide, but the Gateway Cities is located in Southeast Los Angeles County. Great, thank you. It's home to over 2 million residents, consisting of 27 cities and 8 unincorporated communities. It has been one of the hardest hit areas in LA County by the COVID crisis. Yet despite this, cities are still mandated by state housing law to update their 6-cycle housing elements and to increase their zoning capacity by over 76,000 new housing units, a number that's 5 times greater than the allocation from the previous planning cycle. My goal broadly as a fellow was to support the COG and taking advantage of existing and new sources of funding and assistance to advance housing planning in the midst of pandemic response and recovery. Next slide, please. As I entered my service year, COVID raised interesting questions related to social equity, which fell at the nexus of health, housing, and economic well-being. One big question was about how local government can help provide healthy and stable housing for residents across the spectrum of socioeconomic need. During the height of the pandemic, the Gateway Cities made headlines as a hotspot for COVID transmission, a reality related to the demographics of the region, which has a large population of immigrant and essential workers who faced increased risks of exposure. This demographic is also more likely to live in situations of housing overcrowding, face housing instability, and higher cost burdens for housing. In the chart to the left, you can see that 83% of residents in the Gateway Cities region who live below the poverty line are cost burdened, which means that they pay over 30% of their income on housing. The burden reduces as income level rises, but still show a significant toll. 76% of very low income residents and almost 50% of low income residents are also cost burdened. And in the Gateway Cities, as it is across the state of California, the production of housing for lower income residents is not keeping pace with the need. From 2013 to 18, much of the new housing built in the Gateway region was for people with above moderate incomes, as shown in the chart on the right in the green. And the market rate price tag is above what most working class residents can afford. So the region, like many others in Southern California, still has progress to make in terms of providing affordable housing that reduces the cost burden on vulnerable residents. And the dual reality of pressures from increased planning requirements, coupled with the challenges from COVID, has made it even more important that our region take full advantage of available resources and support. Next slide, please. So I used 3 strategies to help build resilience in our region for housing: promoting access to funding, improving the COG's knowledge of local housing needs, and helping the region leverage partnerships with key stakeholders. First, to support access to funding, I helped the COG cities received timely information and assistance related to 3 housing planning grants shown below. The REAP grant, which brought in an additional $150,000 in funding during my service year to the region. The PLH-8 grant, which has allocated $28 million in funding to cities thus far. And the REAP program, which we heard mentioned a little bit earlier from some of the SCAG fellows, which will bring $1.3 million to the Gateway region. Next slide, please. I've also worked on a project, a pretty cool project, to create case studies to highlight best practices in affordable housing development. The goal here is to promote collaborative and peer learning among cities. On the right, you can see a photo of a draft prototype developed in consultation with design firm Studio 111 of what those case studies would look like once they're ultimately featured and uploaded to the COG website. I also spearheaded the creation of a biweekly planning newsletter, which is on the right, which is shared with planning directors via our mailing list and gives timely announcements on grants, webinars, and trainings and other resources as well. Next slide, please. And then in terms of leveraging partnerships, we established a technical assistance program with the Housing and Community Development Department, or HCD, specifically tailored for the gateway cities to support preparation for the 6 cycle housing element updates. Since we began, we've held 6 sessions and counting. We've had over 130 attendees combined to join our sessions, and we've reached over 60% of our cities in the process. We also leverage partnerships with various housing developers, particularly nonprofit housing developers, to elevate the conversations on affordable housing development as part of our quarterly affordable housing workshop series, which began last year in 2020, and has reached upward of 60 guests, per event. Our partners have included the West Hollywood Community Housing Corporation, Link Housing, and a panel of guests from the Urban Land Institute, LA. Finally, we worked with a team of graduate students from USC's Price School Public Policy to conduct research on the impacts of COVID-19 on housing instability in the region, and the findings of which were presented to the COG cities and will also be featured on the COG website. Next slide. So this concludes my presentation. Thank you again for the time to share my service here with you. It's been an honor to serve as a Civic Spark Fellow. If anyone would like to reach out to me for follow-up questions or comments, feel free to use the contact information listed on the slide. Thanks.
Congratulations, Erica, and thanks again for your service. So right now, I just want to open it up again for questions from the audience. Question for myself, Erica. In terms of the planning newsletter that you guys are putting together, do you seem to have a lot of engagement from stakeholders from that, or if you had any of the analytics on that?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that? My audio was a little down.
Yeah, no problem. Do you see the gateway cities having a lot of engagement from the newsletter that you guys put out on a bi-weekly basis?
Yeah, we have. We've gotten some good response from the newsletter, and we hope to be able to deepen our engagement. One of the recommendations I'd like to make before going is just maybe do a survey or a poll just to get have a more formalized process of soliciting feedback on the usefulness and utility of the information that we share. It's not only for housing, it's for our planning directors. So of course, they deal with several planning areas in their capacity. But yeah, we have gotten some good response thus far. And I think it's a good starting point to help streamline some of the communication channels that comes down from the COG, which is sub-regional, to the 27 cities that are members of our agency. So hopefully it'll be a good launching point for more engagement in the future.
Well, thanks again, Erica. And last but not least, we'll be hearing from another SCAG fellow, Vanessa Reyes Salazar, who is also studying the Southern California Association of Governments. So Vanessa, I'll be handing it over to you.
Thanks, Amanda, and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Vanessa Reyes Salazar, and I am one of the SCAG Climate Fellows. Shout out to Amanda Castle and Natalie Arriaga. They presented a couple of days ago, but my work this year was a little bit leaning more towards housing over climate, so I am here with you all. And this service year with SCAG, I got to learn a little bit about tax increment financing and got to lead the update of one of the sites within SCAG's website. So for a little bit of background, one of the key connections of SCAG's 2020 Connect SoCal plan is the Housing Supportive Infrastructure Key Connection, which supports local jurisdictions in implementing water and sewer capacity enhancements to reduce housing costs and increase housing. And tax increment financing can fund these housing supportive infrastructure costs, as well as a wide range of other projects, such as climate adaptation projects, affordable housing, transit, to name some examples. And in order to provide SCAG jurisdictions and stakeholders with some current information and best practices on tax increment financing tools, I updated SCAG's existing smart growth infrastructure website with some updated content on tax increment financing tools. And you can see a screenshot of what the homepage of the smart growth infrastructure website looks like on the top right. And the website was already an existing site within SCAG's website that has some really good information on some of the funding sources and financing tools available to local jurisdictions. So for this update, I built off of that existing content to provide some current information on tax increment financing tools. And so this update included adding information on the 6 current tax increment financing districts available. And that included providing information on related legislation, the formation requirements, and eligible project types for each tax increment financing district. And you can find this information within the value capture page within the Smart Growth Infrastructure website. A screenshot of what the value capture page looks like can be found in the bottom left. And here's an example of what one of the sections of one of the tax increment financing districts I added. And also with this update, I added a total of 9 case studies of tax increment financing districts that have been fully formed and are in process of formation within the SCAG region, as well as across the state. And also added a dedicated case study, section 2, climate adaptation and resilient infrastructure, to highlight climate adaptation as a project type that can be funded by certain types of tax increment financing districts. And the case studies can be found within the case studies page within the website. And if you scroll down from the homepage, the case studies, the URL to the case studies page is the first one that pops up. So it's right there at the beginning of the website. And in order to promote this resource and engage with SCAG's stakeholders, I led a Toolbox Tuesday webinar training earlier this year in February, where I went into depth into the website's content as well as led a live demo. And this was a really great opportunity to engage with SCAG stakeholders and kind of get some feedback in real time as to the website and what was most helpful. For example, one of the pieces of feedback I got was that the case studies portion and getting to see some best practices was the most helpful for jurisdictions. Next slide, please. And a recording of the Toolbox Tuesday webinar is available for anyone to view. The recording, link to the recording is here on the slide. And I invite you all to check out the Smart Growth Infrastructure website. It can be found at scag.ca.gov/smart-growth-infrastructure. And just a little bit about next steps for me. After serving for 2 years at SCAG, I will be starting my master's in urban and regional planning in the fall. So thank you all for your time, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thanks, Vanessa. Quick question from Erica. How do local governments qualify for TIF? Is it primarily for funding infrastructure, or does it fund other planning areas as well?
Yeah, good question. So the jurisdictions can form a tax increment financing district within their area, depending on each district has their own kind of requirements in terms, some of them are only able to fund projects that are within the city. It's that within are the same boundaries as that city or county that's establishing it. Other districts are a little bit more flexible and allow you to fund projects that are within the project area established for that financing district. But for the most part, the TIF districts fund infrastructure projects. They also are eligible to fund, some of them can fund environmental remediation projects. Yeah, so for the most part, I would say infrastructure projects are what TIF primarily funds.
And Vanessa, could you walk through what SCAG's Toolbox Tuesdays are?
Yeah, so Toolbox Tuesdays are a series of webinars that are led by SCAG staff on a particular topic or tool coming up. And I can put a link in the chat to all of the, anytime there's a Toolbox Tuesday webinar, the recording is posted within just a couple of days following that webinar. And so it's essentially a 1 hour, 2 hour training on a particular topic or tool led by SCAG staff. And I will put that link in the chat for you all to reference. There's some really good recordings of previous Toolbox Tuesdays.
All right. Congratulations, Vanessa, and thank you again for your service. And with that, this is a wrap for today's presentation from our fellows. One final congratulations to all the fellows that presented today, and thank you for those of you in our audience for your participation, support, and encouragement. We encourage you to continue to support our fellows by reaching out to them on their LinkedIn or by email. All of the fellow contact information is available on our website under our fellows. We'll go ahead and try to send that out right now. But if you would like to attend other additional poster sessions, please feel free to visit our website for the full schedule of activities and the registration links for the poster symposium. We have 4 more this week in our graduation celebration on July 29th. The next poster symposium session is Resilience in the Face of Water Woes, which will take place tomorrow at 1 p.m. And also, just for those of you that have attended, recordings of these sessions will be available on our website within a follow-up email link sent to all attendees during the last week of July. But with that, I will let everyone go for the rest of the afternoon. But thank you again to everyone, and have a good rest of your day.